Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Kalen worked the dust from his lungs with a practiced, hollow cough. It was the same dust that coated the inside of his small cabin, the viewport of his land speeder, and the surface of the barren moon called Xylos. It was a fine, silicate powder, the ground-down bones of a world that had died so long ago nobody remembered it had ever been alive. He had been the sole warden of Reclamation Post 7 for 3 standard years, a sinecure granted to former hegemony enforcers who had seen too much and were now considered too brittle for frontline duty. It was a quiet sentence, a slow erosion of spirit that mirrored the wind's patient work on the mesas outside. His cabin was a prefabricated box of welded plasteel and recycled insulation, dropped onto the moon's surface with all the care of a discarded ration pack. Inside, the air was perpetually stale, tasting of ozone and his own solitude. He ran a maintenance diagnostic on the perimeter fence generators, his eyes tracing the familiar green lines on the flickering holoscreen. The routine was his anchor, a series of meaningless tasks that kept the deeper silence at bay. He checked power levels, atmospheric filters, and the status of the deep-level containment unit. Everything was nominal, as it always was. The hegemony liked its ledgers clean and its problems buried deep. The problem beneath his feet was designated Asset 47. He had never seen it, not truly. Protocol was explicit. Wardens were caretakers of the machinery, not its contents. The files he could access were heavily redacted, speaking of a biological energy source of unparalleled potential, recovered from the deep crust during the initial survey. They called it a Xylan, a name that meant nothing, a ghost from a dead species. To Kalen, it was just a set of glowing amber metrics on his console, a steady hum that vibrated up through the station's foundation on the quietest nights. He finished his patrol checks and leaned back, the worn synth leather of his chair groaning in protest. Outside, the two small, bitter suns of the system were beginning their slow descent, painting the gray wasteland in shades of bruised purple and rust. He remembered other skies, vibrant and alive, skies he had once fought under, believing he was bringing order to a chaotic galaxy. Now he knew he had only ever been an instrument of consumption, a hammer wielded by the hegemony to break worlds for whatever marrow they might contain. The disillusionment was a cold, heavy stone in his gut, a permanent part of his internal landscape. A new alert chimed, a soft, insistent tone that cut through the monotonous drone of the life support. He straightened, his gaze snapping to the console. It was an anomaly in the containment field, sublevel 4. A power fluctuation, minor but persistent. His standing orders were clear. Any deviation in the asset's containment parameters required immediate notification of regional command. He rested his hand over the comms panel, his fingers hovering above the activation stud. He hesitated. A call to command would bring auditors, technicians, and questions he had no interest in answering. It would bring the hegemony's sterile, suffocating presence to his quiet exile. He decided to investigate himself. It was a minor breach of protocol, but out here, on the forgotten edge of hegemony space, protocols were flexible. He keyed in his access code, and a section of the floor plating retracted with a hiss of pressurized air, revealing a grated steel staircase that spiraled down into the cold, artificial darkness. The air that rose to meet him was different, carrying the clean, sharp scent of energized circuitry and something else, something organic and faintly metallic, like old blood. He grabbed a heavy-duty torch from its charging cradle and began his descent. The station went deep. The upper levels were for him. The lower levels were for the asset. Each level he passed was colder and quieter than the last, the plasteel walls giving way to bare, laser-cut rock. By the time he reached sublevel 4, the only sounds were the echo of his own boots on the grated floor and the low, resonant thrum of the containment generator. The chamber was immense, a perfect cube carved from the moon's bedrock. In its center, suspended in a shimmering lattice of golden energy, was Asset 47. It was not an object. It was a creature. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. It was humanoid in shape, tall and impossibly slender, with skin the color of polished obsidian. Its limbs were long, its form graceful even in forced stasis. Long, silvery hair floated around its head as if submerged in water. It was female. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the tension in the lines of her body, the subtle clenching of her hands. The golden energy field that held her flickered violently where it touched her skin, and a low, pained sound, more a vibration than a noise, emanated from her. He approached the master control plinth, the torch beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. The diagnostic screen was awash of red warnings. The primary emitters were failing, drawing too much power and causing cascading feedback. The system was hurting her. Protocol offered two solutions. Attempt a full system reboot, which had a high probability of terminal failure for the asset, or engage the final dispensation protocols. Termination. He was supposed to be a simple caretaker, but the console in front of him gave him the power of a god or an executioner. He looked from the angry red text to the figure in the field. He saw not an asset, but a prisoner. He saw the same weary resignation he felt in his own bones, magnified 1,000 times. A flicker of something he had thought long dead, a spark of defiance, of empathy, ignited within him. He could not press the button that would extinguish her. He could not be the hammer anymore. Instead, he accessed the station's auxiliary power grid, the emergency reserves meant to sustain his own life support in a catastrophe. It was a flagrant violation, an electronic scream that would be logged on a dozen different hegemony servers. With deft, certain movements, he began rerouting the energy, shunting it past the failing emitters and directly into the containment field stabilizers. The amber metrics on the main console shifted from red to a steady, hopeful yellow. The violent flickering of the energy lattice subsided, its light softening into a gentle, constant glow. The pain vibrations ceased. For a long moment, there was only the hum of restored power. Then, slowly, the figure in the field turned her head. She looked directly at him. Her eyes were large and luminous, the color of molten silver, and in their depths he saw not fear or hatred, but a profound and ancient intelligence. It was a gaze that saw straight through his enforcer armor, his warden's uniform, and the calloused shell he had built around his soul. It was an act of unforeseen kindness, an act of rebellion, and it had sealed his fate. The alarm was immediate and unforgiving. A klaxon blared through the entire facility, its jarring cry echoing off the rock walls of the containment chamber. Red lights strobed in time with the noise, bathing the Stark chamber in a pulsating, hellish glow. On the console, a new message flashed in blocky, accusatory text. Unauthorized power diversion. Protocol breach. Regional command alerted. Kalen swore, a bitter curse lost in the din. He had known this was a possibility, but the speed of the system's reaction was staggering. The hegemony's electronic leash was shorter and tighter than he had ever imagined. He knew what came next. A query from his direct superior, Warden Walker. Then, when he failed to respond with a satisfactory explanation, a dispatch. A kill team. They would not come to ask questions. They would come to sanitize a problem, and he was now the primary contaminant. His life, measured in quiet, dusty years, was now likely measured in minutes. He looked at the creature in the field. Her silver eyes were still fixed on him, calm and watchful amidst the chaos. She had seen this before. She understood the cold, brutal logic of their shared captor. There was only one path: to run. But escape from Xylos was impossible for one man. The moon was a fortress, its orbital space monitored, its surface barren and lethal. His only chance, his only conceivable weapon, was the very asset he was meant to be guarding. His hand went to the emergency release controls. Freeing her was an act of treason punishable by slow, inventive death. It was also his only hope. He met her gaze again, a silent question passing between them. He was offering a trade, her freedom for his life. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. His fingers flew across the control surface, inputting the deactivation sequence. The system fought him, demanding confirmations and override codes he barely possessed. As the final command was entered, the klaxon abruptly cut out, replaced by an even more terrifying sound, the deep, mechanical groan of the containment emitters powering down. The golden lattice of light flickered, thinned, and then dissolved into nothing. For a moment, the woman, the Xylan, remained suspended in the air, then she crumpled, falling to the plasteel floor with a weightless grace. Kalen rushed to her side. She was weak, her body trembling from the shock of release after what must have been decades, or even centuries, of confinement. He offered a hand. She looked at it, then back to his face, her silver eyes searching for the trap. He kept his hand steady, his expression open. After a long moment, she accepted, her long, cool fingers wrapping around his armored gauntlet. Her touch was light, yet he felt an immense, dormant power in her grip. He helped her to her feet. She stood taller than him, a being of impossible elegance forged in a world utterly alien to his own. "They're coming," he said, his voice rough. "We have to move." She did not speak, but her understanding was clear. She followed as he led them from the chamber, her movements stiff and uncertain at first, but growing stronger with every step. They ascended through the station, the emergency lighting casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and grasp at them. He grabbed his pulse rifle from the armory locker on the main level and slung a go bag over his shoulder. Extra power cells, water purifier, medkit, the bare essentials for survival in the wastes. A proximity alert pinged on his wrist comm, one vessel. Hegemony dropship, designation Harbinger. Fast response assault craft. Estimated surface arrival, 7 minutes. His blood ran cold. It was Thorn's ship. Subcommander Thorn was Valkyr's bluntest instrument, a zealot who relished his work with a chilling enthusiasm. Kalen had served under him once, long ago. He knew Thorn's tactics: overwhelming force, no quarter, no survivors. This way, Kalen snapped, pulling the Xylan toward a maintenance access corridor. It was a labyrinth of grimy tunnels and humming conduits, a route not shown on any official schematic. It was their only chance to get clear of the station before Thorn's troops stormed it. They moved quickly, the tight confines forcing them close. He could feel the faint coolness emanating from her skin, could smell the scent of ozone and something like petrichor, the smell of rain on dry earth. He did not even know her name. She was a key, a mystery, and now, his unwilling partner in a desperate flight. They had almost reached an exit hatch leading to the surface when a harsh voice echoed through the tunnel's comm grill. "Warden Kalen, this is Subcommander Thorn. You are relieved of duty. Power down your weapon and surrender the asset. Comply, and Warden Valkyr may show you mercy." The voice was slick with false reason, a predator cooing at its cornered prey. Kalen ignored it. He knew Thorn's mercy. He had seen it etched in the blasted ruins of a dozen worlds. He was working the manual release on the heavy hatch when the tunnel behind them erupted in a flash of white-hot light. A plasma charge slagged the wall where they had been standing seconds before. Thorn hadn't even waited for a reply. They were through the hatch and into the thin, freezing twilight of Xylos just as a second blast hit, the force of the explosion throwing them forward onto the dusty ground. Kalen scrambled to his feet, pulling the Xylan behind the cover of a rocky outcropping. Below them, floodlights from the station cut through the gloom, and the disciplined, armored shapes of Thorn's enforcers were already spreading out, forming a perimeter. They were pinned down. The enforcers advanced, their pulse rifles methodically sweeping the terrain. A volley of plasma bolts stitched across the rock above their heads, showering them with superheated grit. Kalen returned fire, his shots precise, aimed to suppress rather than kill. It was a futile gesture. He was one man against a squad of elite soldiers. He was buying seconds, nothing more. Another plasma volley struck a thick power conduit running along the rock face just beside them. The cable, thick as his arm, split open with a deafening crack. Raw, unshielded energy arced out, a blinding, chaotic web of blue lightning. Kalen saw it coming, a whip of pure energy snapping directly toward the Xylan. There was no time to think. He reacted on instinct, the old enforcer instinct to protect his partner. He threw himself sideways, shoving her hard. The energy whip caught him across the back and shoulder. The pain was absolute, a white-hot fire that consumed his senses and seared through his body armor. His vision flared white, and he cried out, a raw, ragged sound. He collapsed, his rifle clattering against the rocks. The world swam in a haze of agony, the smell of his own burning flesh filling his nostrils. Through the pain, he saw the Xylan. She had turned, her silver eyes wide, not with fear, but with a sudden, terrifying fury. She looked at his smoking wound, then at the advancing enforcers. She raised her hand. The air itself seemed to ripple, to bend around her. A low hum resonated from her, a sound that vibrated deep in Kalen's bones. The enforcers hesitated, their weapons lowering slightly as they witnessed something beyond their training manuals. Thorn's voice crackled over their comms, tinny and urgent. "What are you waiting for? Subdue her." But it was too late. The Xylan closed her hand into a fist, and the world buckled. A wave of pure kinetic force, invisible and silent, erupted from her. It struck the enforcers like a physical blow, lifting them from their feet and hurling them back against the station walls. Armor crumpled, and bodies fell like discarded dolls. The ground beneath Kalen shook as if from a localized earthquake. The assault was broken, the squad neutralized in a single, silent, devastating gesture. She then turned and knelt beside him, her expression a mixture of concern and something else, something he could not read. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over his burnt shoulder. In that moment, a bond was forged, not in words, but in shared violence and mutual protection. They were no longer just a warden and his prisoner. They were allies. The journey began in earnest. The thin, toxic air of Xylos clawed at Kalen's throat, each breath a reminder of how utterly alien this world was to him. He had sealed the burn on his shoulder with a medical cauterizer from his kit, a crude and agonizing process that left him dizzy and weak. The pain was a constant, grinding presence, a fire that gnawed at the edges of his awareness. Yet he pushed on, driven by the certainty of Thorn's relentless pursuit. They moved across the fractured plains, a desolate expanse of gray dust and shattered rock that stretched to a horizon blurred by silicate haze. His companion, the Xylan, moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied the harshness of the terrain. She seemed untroubled by the thin atmosphere or the biting cold that seeped through Kalen's insulated gear as the twin suns sank completely. She was a part of this dead world, a native ghost in her own graveyard. He tried to name her, in his own mind. He settled on Lyra, for a constellation he remembered from his childhood, a cluster of distant, silver stars. It seemed to fit the light in her eyes. Their communication was a sparse and evolving language of gesture and instinct. A pointed finger from him indicated a potential route or a place for cover. A slight tilt of her head signaled danger he could not yet perceive. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the two suns. They survived on ration bars from his pack and brackish water he filtered from deep, hidden seeps that Lyra found with an uncanny certainty. She would place her hand on the rock, close her eyes, and then lead him unerringly to a trickle of life-sustaining moisture. The land itself was their enemy. Corrosive acid rain fell in sudden, violent squalls, forcing them to take shelter in narrow crevasses or beneath towering rock formations that looked like the petrified ribs of colossal beasts. Seismic tremors shook the ground without warning, threatening to send them tumbling into the deep canyons that scarred the moon's face. Through it all, Lyra was a steady presence. During one particularly violent tremor, Kalen lost his footing, his burnt shoulder screaming as he slid toward the edge of a precipice. Before he could fall, her hand shot out, grabbing his arm with a strength that belied her slender frame. She pulled him back from the brink, her grip like steel, her silver eyes holding his until the shaking subsided. They found refuge in a place she seemed to be searching for, a destination known only to her. It was a network of caves, their entrances hidden behind a curtain of wind-scoured rock. The air inside was still and ancient. As they ventured deeper, Kalen's torch revealed walls covered in faded, intricate carvings. They were not mere decorations, they were a story. He saw tall, slender figures like Lyra, surrounded by images of a world teeming with strange, bioluminescent flora. He saw depictions of the twin suns, but in these images, they were worshipped, not cursed. This was not a wasteland. It had been a garden. Lyra led him to the heart of the cavern, a vast, circular chamber where a faint, ethereal light emanated from crystalline veins in the rock. She placed her palm flat against a smooth, central monolith. The light in the chamber brightened, and images, ghostly and ephemeral, began to swirl in the air around them. They were not projections, they were memories, thoughts given form. Kalen saw the arrival of the hegemony ships, great, ugly wedges of gray metal descending from the sky. He saw the drills, continent-sized machines that bit deep into the planet's crust, seeking the exotic matter that formed the moon's core. He witnessed the truth. The hegemony had not discovered a dead world. They had murdered it. The Xylans had tried to communicate, to warn them that the core was not just a mineral deposit, but a living, semi-sentient heart that regulated the world's delicate ecosystem. The hegemony had interpreted their warnings as aggression. The violence had been swift and absolute. He saw cities of crystal and light shattered into dust. He saw Lyra's people falling, their life force extinguished by the cold calculus of resource acquisition. The final vision was the most terrible. He saw the hegemony's great drill deliver a final, fracturing blow. The moon's core cracked, its energy bleeding out chaotically. The atmosphere was stripped away, the oceans boiled into vapor, and the vibrant world died in a silent, cosmic scream. Lyra had been captured, preserved because her unique biology was resonant with the core's energy, making her a living key, a tool to control and exploit the very power that had been unleashed. Warden Walker wasn't just guarding a power source. He was preparing to bleed it dry, a final act of desecration that would likely destabilize the entire star system. The visions faded, leaving Kalen breathless and shaken. He looked at Lyra, seeing her now not as an alien, but as the last survivor of a genocide. The hegemony's lie was laid bare. He had not been keeping order. He had been standing guard on a tomb, an accomplice after the fact. His cynicism had been a shield, but it was not thick enough to deflect this truth. He had been fighting for a cause. It had simply been the wrong one. Later, as they rested in the quiet dark of the caves, the shared ordeal hung between them. He tended to his burn, the damaged tissue a constant, throbbing reminder of his choice. Lyra approached him silently. She reached out, her long, slender fingers gently touching the scarred flesh of his shoulder. As she made contact, a jolt, not of pain, but of pure information, passed between them. He saw flashes of her life. The warmth of the twin suns on her skin, the song of her people, the crushing, unending loneliness of her long imprisonment. He felt the echo of her grief, a sorrow so vast it was like an ocean. In that moment of contact, something in him broke open. Without conscious thought, he let his own walls fall. She saw his past, his own scars. She saw the boy who had enlisted with dreams of heroism. She saw the enforcer on the blasted fields of Cygnus X-1, following Thorne's orders to pacify a civilian uprising, the memory of the smoke and the screams still haunting his sleep. She saw the man who had requested a transfer to the quietest, most distant post he could find, hoping to outrun his own ghosts. She saw his pain, his regret, his deep, abiding shame. She pulled her hand back. Her silver eyes held a new understanding. They were both survivors, scarred by the same brutal hand. He was a tool that had been used and discarded. She was a resource that had been plundered. In the silent, glowing heart of her dead world, their shared history of pain became a bridge. The alliance forged in desperation was now tempered into something stronger. Trust. Their sanctuary in the ruins could not last. A high-altitude drone, a glinting speck of malice against the bruised sky, signaled the end of their brief respite. Thorne was hunting them with systematic precision. They were flushed out of the caves and back into the open wasteland. But this time, the nature of the chase had changed. Kalen was no longer just running for his life. He was fighting for Lyra's. He was fighting for the memory of her people. Thorne's forces engaged them near a canyon of jagged, crystalline spires. It was a brutal, direct confrontation. Hegemony assault craft swooped down, strafing the ground with heavy plasma cannons that vaporized rock and sent shards of superheated crystal flying like shrapnel. On the ground, squads of enforcers advanced under the cover of suppressive fire, their movements disciplined and utterly ruthless. They were a tide of black armor and methodical violence. Kalen and Lyra fought back-to-back, a desperate pairing of technology and raw power. He used his knowledge of enforcer tactics against them, anticipating their flanking maneuvers, laying traps with proximity mines from his pack. His pulse rifle, hot in his hands, became an extension of his will, each shot placed with the cold economy of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of killing. He moved with a grim purpose he had not felt in years, the jaded veteran replaced by a focused, determined soldier with a cause worth dying for. Lyra was a force of nature. She did not need a weapon. The air around her was her weapon. She gestured, and a storm of razor-sharp rock shards flew from the canyon walls, shredding the armor of an advancing squad. She raised her hands, and the very ground beneath a heavy assault walker buckled and split, swallowing the machine whole. Her power was immense, primal, but Kaelin could see the cost. A thin trickle of silver, like mercury, ran from her nose. A faint tremor ran through her body after each significant exertion. Her imprisonment had weakened her, and this sustained conflict was draining her reserves at a dangerous rate. They managed to break through the encirclement, but the confrontation had made two things terrifyingly clear. First, Thorn would not stop. His pursuit was now personal, a vicious vendetta against the former subordinate who had defied him. Second, and more importantly, they could not win this way. For every enforcer they disabled, two more would take their place. The hegemony's resources were virtually infinite. Warden Valkyr could pour troops and machines onto this desolate moon until it was buried under a mountain of wreckage. A direct military victory was a fantasy. They found temporary cover in the shadow of a derelict hegemony terraforming rig, a metal behemoth half buried in the dust, its skeletal frame a monument to the hubris that had destroyed this world. As Kaelin frantically worked to recharge his rifle's last power cell from the rig's decaying energy core, Lyra stood watching the sky. The orbital blockade was now in place. Dozens of hegemony cruisers hung in the void, a net of steel and plasma drawn tight around Xylos. Then, Kaelin saw it too. A single, massive beam of concentrated energy lanced down from the largest cruiser, Valkyr's command ship, striking the moon's surface miles from their position. It was not a weapon. It was a drill. The truth of Valkyr's endgame struck Kaelin with the force of a physical blow. The visions Lyra had shown him were not just history, they were a blueprint. Valkyr was not just trying to recapture his asset. He was using her energy signature, which was now active and broadcasting across the moon, as a targeting beacon. He was guiding a massive drill directly to the fractured, unstable heart of Xylos. He intended to finish what the first hegemony survey team had started, to crack the core wide open and harvest the raw chaos of the singularity within. The act would grant the hegemony unimaginable power, but the resulting shockwave would annihilate the entire star system. It was a plan born of monstrous ambition and utter indifference to the cost. The war was unwinnable, and the stakes had just been raised from their own survival to the fate of billions. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm Kaelin. They were two fugitives on a dying world, standing against an empire at the height of its power. They had no army, no fleet, no hope of rescue. It was then that Lyra turned to him, her silver eyes calm and resolute in the face of annihilation. She placed her hand on the rusted metal of the terraforming rig, then looked toward Reclamation Post 7, a faint shimmer of light on the distant horizon. Through a new, more refined connection, not of visions, but of pure, silent understanding, she showed him the solution. It was not a plan for victory. It was a plan for sacrifice. The moon's core was a wound, bleeding energy into the void. She, as a Xylan, could soothe it, could use her own life force to stabilize the singularity and render it inert. But she could not do it alone. The hegemony's technology, the very drilling beam that threatened to destroy everything, was inextricably linked to the core's instability. To calm the core, she needed to interface with the system that was attacking it. She needed a bridge, a conduit between her organic, living energy and the cold, digital logic of the hegemony's control network. She needed someone to physically connect to the primary control nexus back at the outpost, to become a living, breathing circuit breaker. The person who did this would have to absorb the entire feedback loop, channeling the chaotic energy of the dying core and the focused power of Valkyr's drill. Their consciousness, their very identity, would be scoured away, burned out by the sheer force of the event. What remained would be subsumed, merged with the moon's own geoelectric field. They would become a permanent part of the system, a silent, eternal guardian. A ghost in the machine, a living seal on a cosmic tomb. She was showing him the only way to stop the war, to save the system. And she was presenting him with an impossible choice. The weight of that choice settled upon Kaelin, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. He retreated into the silence of his own thoughts, the howling of the silicate wind a fitting soundtrack to the storm in his soul. He walked to the edge of their makeshift shelter, staring out at the vast, empty wasteland under the cold, indifferent light of the distant stars. He considered his life a long, gray road paved with compromise and regret. He had joined the enforcers seeking purpose and had found only proficiency in violence. He had followed orders, believing in the grand narrative of hegemony, order, and stability, only to discover it was a lie built on a foundation of crushed worlds and forgotten peoples. His existence on Xylos had been a penance, a self-imposed exile from a galaxy he no longer understood or cared for. He had been waiting to die, not with a bang, but with the slow, quiet fizzle of a spent power cell. He was a man hollowed out by his past, a ghost long before this final, impossible choice was laid before him. What was one more ghost in a galaxy full of them? He looked back at Lyra. She stood near the humming, decaying power core of the old rig, her slender form bathed in its faint blue light. She was the last vestige of a beauty he could barely comprehend, a living testament to all that the hegemony destroyed in its rapacious march across the stars. To save her, to save the memory of her people, to undo, in one final, absolute act, the damage he had been a part of. It was a purpose clearer and more pure than any order he had ever been given. It was a chance to make his end mean more than his life ever had. The internal conflict was not a raging battle, but a quiet, somber settling of accounts. The part of him that clung to survival, the cynical, scarred soldier, argued that it was not his fight. He owed this galaxy nothing. It had taken everything from him. But another voice, one he had not heard in years, the voice of the boy who had once looked at the stars with wonder, argued back. This was not about saving the galaxy. It was about saving one thing of worth. It was about one final act of defiance against the crushing, soulless machine he had served. It was about balance. His life, empty and used up, in exchange for the future of countless others, and for the soul of this one last Xylan. His deliberation was over. He had wrestled with the shadow of his past, and found his peace in the acceptance of his future, a future measured now only in hours. He walked back to Lyra, his steps steady on the shifting dust. He did not need to speak. The time for words, if it had ever existed between them, was long past. He stopped before her and simply looked at the schematic of the reclamation post's control nexus, which he had been studying on his datapad. He traced the lines leading to the primary conduit, the point of interface. Then he met her gaze. His expression was not one of fear or despair, but of calm resolve. He was ready. She understood immediately. Her silver eyes, which had seen the death of a world, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to absorb the very light around them. She reached out, not to touch him, but to lay her hand over his on the datapad, her cool fingers covering the schematic of his sacrifice. It was a gesture of acceptance, of shared burden, of immense and tragic respect. In the humming silence of the derelict machine, surrounded by the bones of her world, they made their pact. There was no victory to be won, only a price to be paid, and he had just volunteered to pay it. The journey back to Reclamation Post 7 was a final, desperate pilgrimage. They moved under the cover of the deepest dark, a sliver of time between the setting of the first sun and the rising of the second. The ground shook more frequently now, the deep, resonant groan of Valkyr's drill a constant reminder of the countdown they were racing against. The very air seemed to crackle with stolen energy. They were no longer just fugitives. They were saboteurs, returning to the source of their captivity to enact a final, terrible rebellion. The outpost was transformed. What had once been a quiet, solitary station was now an armed camp. Temporary floodlights cast harsh, overlapping circles of white light across the terrain, eliminating every shadow. Patrols of enforcers marched in rigid, predictable patterns, their black armor making them seem like beetles skittering across the dust. At the heart of it all, the main entrance to the station was heavily fortified, guarded by automated plasma turrets and a platoon of Thorn's elite guard. A direct assault was suicide. Kalen led Lyra to a spot he remembered from his maintenance routines, a ventilation shaft for the geothermal converters, its opening small and half-buried by a rock slide. It was their way in. They slipped through the outer perimeter and into the guts of the station, the familiar hum of the machinery now overlaid with the urgent shouts of soldiers and the thrum of a base on high alert. They were inside the belly of the beast. They moved through the maintenance corridors. A shadow war fought in silence. A two-man patrol turning a corner met Kalen's silenced pistol and Lyra's disorienting kinetic pulse. They were ghosts, moving toward the heart of the station, down toward the sublevels, toward the primary control nexus located in a shielded chamber directly beneath the warden's office. It was there, Kalen knew, that Valker would be. The man was an egotist. He would want to personally oversee his grand triumph. As they reached the final access corridor to the nexus chamber, they found their way blocked. Subcommander Thorne stood waiting, flanked by his two most loyal guards. He held a high-energy plasma rifle, its coils glowing with malevolent intent. There was no surprise on his face, only a cold, predatory smile. He had anticipated their target. "I knew you'd come back, Kalen," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Always predictable, always drawn to a lost cause." "It's over, Thorne," Kalen said, his own rifle held at the ready. "Valker's plan is insane. It will destroy everything." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "It is glorious. A new era of power for the hegemony. And you are a traitor, standing with that thing. I will enjoy putting you down." He raised his weapon. Lyra stepped forward. She looked at Kalen, a quick, meaningful glance. "Go. I will handle this." He hesitated for only a second, then trusted her. He broke from cover, sprinting for the Nexus chamber door while Lyra met Thorne's charge head-on. The corridor erupted in a storm of violence. Plasma bolts seared the air, impacting the walls with explosive force. Kalen slammed the door control, the heavy plasteel panel sliding open just as he dove through. He found himself in the Nexus chamber. It was a cathedral of technology, the walls lined with conduits that pulsed with raw energy drawn from the moon's core. In the center of the room, on a raised platform, stood Warden Valker. He was a small, unassuming man in a crisp uniform, his face illuminated by the light of a massive holographic display showing the drill's inexorable progress. He turned, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than alarm. "Kalen," he said, his voice calm and academic. "Your sentimentality is proving to be a significant inconvenience. You're going to tear this system apart," Kalen yelled over the roar of the machinery. "A small price to pay for power beyond imagining," Valker replied, a flicker of fanaticism in his eyes. "But it doesn't have to be this way. You have seen what the asset can do. Join me. Help me control it. You will be rewarded with more power than a man like you could ever dream of." Kalen ignored him. He saw his target, the master control console, the very plinth he had used to free Lyra. It was now glowing with a terrifying intensity, the focal point for the entire drilling operation. He fought his way up the steps of the platform, his pulse rifle firing, forcing Valker to take cover behind the console. The warden was a bureaucrat, not a soldier. But as Kalen closed in, Valker drew a small, elegant energy pistol and fired. The shot went wide, but a second one grazed Kalen's leg, sending a jolt of agony up his side. He gritted his teeth and lunged forward, tackling Valker to the ground. He scrambled to the console, his hands flying across the controls, initiating the sequence Lyra had shown him, the feedback loop. Alarms shrieked. The energy conduits lining the walls began to glow white-hot. Valker, scrambling to his feet, stared in horror. "What have you done? You'll destroy us all." "No," Kalen said, his voice steady. "I'm balancing the books." He placed his hands flat on the console's interface panels. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. It was not the fire of a burn or the sharp edge of a wound, but the feeling of being unmade. Raw energy, a blend of chaotic geology and cold technology, surged up his arms and into his body. His nerves screamed, his vision dissolved into pure, white light. He felt his physical form begin to disintegrate, his atoms untethered from one another. Through the blinding agony, he had one last sensory impression. The door to the Nexus chamber slid open. Lyra stood there, victorious over Thorne. Her silver eyes met his, and in them, he saw not pity, but a universe of gratitude. Then he was gone. His consciousness exploded outward, a wave of thought and memory that washed over the entire station, then the entire moon. He was the dust. He was the rock. He was the thin, biting wind. He was the machine and the ghost within it. He felt the wounded core of Xylos, a screaming knot of pain, and he felt the piercing violation of the hegemony drill. He became the bridge between them. He did not fight the energy. He absorbed it, harmonized it, became it. The effect was immediate. The massive drilling beam, its guiding signal severed, wavered, and died. The violent tremors shaking the moon ceased. On the command bridge of his flagship, Warden Valkyr's holographic display went dark, every metric flatlining into absolute zero. The immense power he had sought to command had been pacified, rendered inert. His grand plan was undone not by an opposing army, but by a profound and total silence. The war for Xylos was over. Years later, the silence held. The hegemony, crippled by the catastrophic failure of its Xylos operation and the subsequent exposure of Warden Valkyr's reckless ambition, had begun to fracture. Its iron grip on the outer systems loosened, and a fragile, uncertain peace began to take root in its place. The great orbital blockade was long gone. The warships were called to fight political fires closer to the core. Xylos was once again a forgotten moon in a quiet sector of space. But it was no longer dead. A faint, pearlescent atmosphere, thin but breathable for a Xylan, now clung to its surface. The process would take centuries, but it had begun. And on the gray dust, a miracle was unfolding. Small, spiraling ferns with bioluminescent fronds had begun to push their way up from the ancient soil, casting a soft, blue-green light across the plains in the long nights. The seeds of a world, dormant for eons, were stirring. Lyra walked through these nascent fields, the gentle light of the plants reflecting in her silver eyes. She was not the same creature Kaelin had freed. The hunted look was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding serenity. She was a queen tending to the first shoots of her reborn kingdom, and she was no longer alone. From the deep, protected caverns near the moon's now stable core, others of her kind had begun to emerge. They were young, awakened from a long, protected hibernation by the new harmony of their world. The Xylan people, once reduced to a single survivor, were breathing again. The old reclamation post 7 still stood, a dark silhouette against the horizon. It was not a place of fear anymore, but a monument, a memorial. Lyra often went there, walking its silent corridors to the heart of the facility, to the Nexus chamber. The room was no longer a place of roaring machinery. It was quiet, the only illumination a soft, steady, rhythmic pulse of light from the master control console. She would approach the plinth and place her palm against its surface. The material was no longer cold plasteel. It felt like smooth, warm stone. And when she touched it, she could feel him. It was not Kaelin the man, not his thoughts or his memories in any distinct form. It was his presence, a quiet, watchful, and protective consciousness woven into the very fabric of the moon. He was the guardian he had chosen to become, his sacrifice not an ending, but a transformation into a foundation for new life. He had balanced the books, and in doing so, had purchased a future he would never see, for a people he had only just met. His legacy was the quiet hum of a healing world and the soft, blue light of life returning to the dust.